Welcome, and I really have high hopes for this day. I mean, our lives are becoming increasingly complex and demanding, so being able to gather such an exceptional task this morning was no easy job, and we're here and we're ready to engage. First, I want to offer my sincere gratitude to the T. Gordon Little Foundation for making this possible. This discourse on imagining a better future is exactly appropriate to the legacy of Mr. Little and the mission of the foundation. The roots of this topic lie in my youth and the politics of post-war Europe. I mean, I saw London in ruins after the war, and I lived through the years of post-war austerity, and even by the late 50s, when I began to study architecture in Edinburgh, the nation had not recovered. All the structures that had sustained the British Empire and promoted these deep class divisions were crumbling, and socialism, the socialism of the post-war years, was driven by the view that having suffered so much, there must be some reward. There was a profound belief in and a vision for a progressive, egalitarian society. And the task for architecture was to provide the stage. We knew this was a heroic task. Schools, hospitals, housing, not homes, the collective, were fundamental building blocks of this new society. And the dominant projects in the studios of all schools at that time were those. And of course, they all strictly obeyed the rules of modernism. Any suggestion of designing for trade or commerce was seen as a betrayal of architecture's moral social project. And as we progressed to larger, more complex visions of a new reality, the future, if you will, giving form to the concept of the new town was the most important and poetically satisfying task. On leaving school, I, like many others of my generation, went to work for a public authority. I joined the London County Council and was immediately given several projects to design, all of which were standard towers, standard plans. And I passed some of them still every time I take the train to Gatwick. One has recently given a pitched roof, I noticed. Progress. I then worked on the University of York before going to Princeton. And the first experience of Princeton was one of dismay and shock. Seminars with Kahn undermined all the principles of modernism and its promise of a purified reality. Peter Eisman's subconscious intellectualizing, I believe, was totally irrelevant. And Michael Graves' imagination, consumed with his memories of Rome, was frankly decadent, and I raged against all of them. But I adjusted, and time passed, and all the structures of my brave new world proved to be as fragile illusions in which the new society decayed as quickly as the fabric. And into the present, architecture has flourished, with many agendas, moral and otherwise, showing more creativity and diversity than any time in its history. But I can't escape that sense from my formative years that there can be a moral center to architecture, and that the search for some condition of authenticity must not be neglected, and that there is a public agenda, a public obligation against which our actions and our imaginations can be measured. Last weekend, I drove street by street through the Ninth Ward of New Orleans and beyond, street after street of neglect and desolation, very occasionally restored house among thousands of abandoned properties. And the 20 or so bright, freshly made architectural projects in the shadow of the canal only served to exaggerate the tragically inadequate response of this nation and our discipline to this disaster. There are brilliant imaginations with us today. And the question I want to keep in my mind and have in their mind is, how do they measure the worth of what they create? How do they deal with that elusive relationship between the subjective imagination and the public good? The elusive relationship between the subjective imagination and the public good. With that, let me introduce our moderators for the day, Paul Finch and Jeffrey Kipnis, two renowned international critics representing two distinct perspectives, the profession and the discipline. Paul Finch, former editor of the Architectural Review, co-organizer of the World Architectural Festival, which is increasingly significant, at least within Europe, consummate critic of the profession, and it says here ranked 21st by Building Design among the 50 most powerful figures in British architecture. I'm disappointed, Paul. This is not good enough. At least the top 5, for goodness sake. As rich with wit as with insight, his writings chart contemporary practice in the moment as it copes daily with new contexts an ever-escalating present in global media, and the realities of increasingly complex and intractable problems, it says here. Thank you, Paul. Joining Mr. Finch to represent the discipline is Jeffrey Kipnis, a colleague of mine from my Atlanta years, and I was partly responsible for involving him in this discipline. Perhaps Mac Scoggin claims some of it. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. But I did invite him to join me at the AA in London, where he created the new graduate program, which really is the strength of the AA in this time. So we have worked well together. Here's what he asked me to say. Notoriously indifferent to architects' most urgent concerns and responsibilities, Mr. Kipnis squanders year after year in various ivory towers across the globe, where he mutters arcane theories about architecture's fundamental role as the discipline and the esoteric power of cultural practice. It is said by Mr. Kipnis, though not yet verified, that his few incomprehensible and unparsable too writings are celebrated by a few elite across the world, perhaps as many as a dozen architects and a few students. That's what he says. We'll put him to the test today. Let me offer a touch of Shakespeare amended to set the tone for the day. This is from A Midsummer Night's Dream. The architect's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagined bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the architect's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy, which is our task for today. Jeffrey Kipnis.
Okay, so it's so good to be home. It's true what Alan said. Basically, my two, Mac and Merrill, actually, I would say, invited me into the field, but it was Alan who was one of my first mentors, followed by Peter Eisenman. I think it's fair to say that Peter Eisen remains as actively intellectually relevant today as he did at the time. So of all the people, it's really quite interesting that I thought. Alan, on the other hand, has found his way into my subconscious for many years, and I dream about him often. Sometimes they're nightmares, and sometimes they're very pleasant dreams, but always in them, there's a moment where he talks about robust imagination. And so imagination had to be part of this conference. And this part Lewis Black, I haven't really got it on yet. So that's why imagination, he is convinced that the only hope left for architecture is to find out some way to make imagination a heck of a lot more important than it actually is. And so, on the other hand, the question of the better future, I think, is something I introduced. And I'm just going to read the provocation I sent to the architects. It seems a Brinksman's moment. On the one hand, we wield today more power over matter at every scale than can ever be imagined, even 50 years ago. A kind of power that holds out the promise that architecture might very soon fulfill the role in life it has aspired to for so long. On the other hand, a mortally injured global economy, imminent environmental concerns, diminished stocks of scarce resources, and a burgeoning population conspire to render our future in dark and uncertain tones. Each of these zones of power and crisis impinge immediately on architecture as a profession and as a practice, a cultural practice. Therefore, how should architecture imagine or reimagine its world-making role? This ostensibly straightforward question is thrice vexed, at least. First, by persistent disquiet, set into motion by the aftermath of modernism's effort to invent a better future. Secondly, by the conspicuous ineffectiveness of architecture and the arts as a tool ably to directly construct a collective future when compared with science, technology, law, or economics. And finally, by a burgeoning utilitarianism that always follows upon a great crisis, wherein all judgments in any discipline should be decided by effecting the greatest good for the most number of people. Since the giant strides of architecture, in my opinion, have taken place as a cultural practice over the last 3 decades, have grown out of a swerve away from a utilitarian discourse, what should we do? So this was the provocation I sent to the architects. As usual, none of them have read it. And so, no. Oh, that's true. I saw Tom reading it this morning. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the setup today, and then I'm going to. each of the architects are going to present as best to their ability, 2 projects, perhaps at different scales, is what I kind of asked them to do, which speaks to the idea of how they think they might be thinking about the future in their work. Because it seems interesting to me that architecture, more than any other discourse, seems about reflecting on the past in relationship to the increasing demands of the present. That in some sense, it doesn't really find itself able or to have time for or the wherewithal to consider the future. But on the other hand, if you have an imagination at all, you are always imagining in some sense about the future. So I've asked them to position as best they possibly can their current work that you'll see in terms of any reflection or maybe state that it was none. Then after each session, after the 2 presentations, Paul Finch and I we're going to put another table up here, and we are going to face each other like face the nation. And Paul and I will interrogate the 2 architects. Now, this has several advantages. On the one hand, it causes us to pay closer attention to each other, and on the other hand, it allows us to completely ignore any interesting questions that come from the audience. So, if you actually want to participate, which we would like to discourage, but it's legally required for us to invite, then you must stand up and yell like they do in English government. And on the note of yelling in English government, now, let me just tell you finally the ulterior agenda of this entire thing. I was at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago, and Paul Finch, a good friend of mine from England from many years ago, and I, for the first time ever, found ourselves actually in a debate about architecture in front of an audience. It was spontaneous and impromptu. I was brilliant, but the audience, for some reason, aligned entirely with Paul and booed me and cheered Paul. You know, I mean, Paul was defending, I don't know, helping people and stuff like that. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to set up a rematch. I'm taking him to my hometown. I'm bringing my friends in. So that's what you'll see today. Let me let Paul make a few words about his point of view, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, Venice was good. Jeffrey was just attacking somebody for flying to Venice rather than walking on water or using a bus or something. I felt obliged to defend. Architecture is, of course, an entirely optimistic activity in the sense that everything architects do is about the future, and it may be based on the past and it exists in the present, but it's entirely, in that sense, optimistic, as I think is this event. Now, in this room last night, Shirley Franklin gave a memorable talk about what it meant to be a politician, what it means to be a politician in this town. And in relation to imagination and imagining, she quoted first William Blake and then John Lennon. That slightly cheesy but nevertheless affecting lyric. Imagine no wealth, imagine no religion, etc., etc. But I couldn't help thinking about the Sgt. Pepper's album, because there's a track on there for the benefit of Mr. Kite, who is referred to in the course of the song as Mr. K. And there's a line which says, for the benefit of Mr. K, there will be a special show on Saturday. And the reason that we're here, ladies and gentlemen, is so Geoffrey Kipnis can make a triumphant return to Atlanta to stride through its splendid new stone arch, designed by an English architect, I may say, and try to exclude all of you from the conversation, which I'm sure we'll be able to avoid happening. I only wanted really to make one sort of introductory point, which is that the whole business about imagining the future, as opposed to trying to calculate it in a kind of faux scientific sense. And I was watching the incredibly detailed Atlanta weather forecast this morning, where it was giving me percentage risks of it being 60 degrees on Wednesday, information I found well able to ignore since I'm going back to London tonight. But it did occur to me that actually when we look at weather forecasts, we tend to think they may be moderately accurate. And the reason for that is because there is data, there are records, there are posting points where they can pick up all this information and translate it through computer power into something which may be useful. Forecast is, nevertheless, does contain an element of risk. and is unlike the predetermined, which would be my base point for the opposite of imagining the future. It's actually saying, well, we know this is going to happen because it's going to happen. For example, this event will take place today, or the Olympics will start on a certain day, etc., etc. Certain things are predetermined, and of course there's a certain frame of mind which loves the predetermined because it actually happens. People who manage hotels like this, because it tells them that they have a 99% occupancy rate as opposed to 98.7, because somebody just booked in and they know they're going to arrive, or at least they know they're going to get the money even if they don't turn up. There's then the forecast. There is then the predicted. Predictions are a step further along the line towards the entirely imagined, since they are based on judgment rather than facts like the weather forecast. And we move from prediction, I think, to the imagined, which may involve nothing more than the divine spark, the creative moment, a curious combination of circumstances in which something happens, which has a relationship to the dreamed. I mean, Noah was somewhere, I suppose, between imagining and dreaming, and then he got into the prediction game. You'll notice that although he was an amateur as a designer, he managed to construct quite a successful vessel, which then brings me to the last word, which isn't really on this continuum at all, which is designed. To what extent can a future be designed once it's been dreamed or imagined or predicted or forecast? And you'll notice in the world of the utilitarian that the forecast and the prediction is king, because without the forecast and the prediction, what is it that you're designing for? But when we get to the dreamed, and when we get to the imagined, which is not to do with function or utility, it's to do with something else. It's to do with creativity. It's to do with love or hate, or observation or history or culture. It is not utilitarian in any normal meaning of the world. A world in which, by the way, rather disappointingly, it turns out that even chaos is in its own way predictable. So I'm looking forward to the presentations today, because I think that architects, whether they necessarily admit it or not, and certainly in Britain, the high-tech tradition would deny it, that there could be any validation of latter-day modernism other than sustainability or integrity or function or sociological requirement. But at some point, especially when you look at the sketches, there was something quite else taking place. Thank you very much.
Okay, round one to you.
Alejandro.
Beautiful. Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to quickly introduce the first two speakers. Most of you probably know Alejandro Zaropolo, former principal of the now dissolved FOA, a highly influential practice for both its publications and its designs like the Yokohama project. Since the firm dissolved, he's been professionally adrift and really aimlessly wandering around. He appears to be trying to raise money to start a new stationery company, which I think is incredibly interesting, which has the curiosity of only wanting to produce envelopes. But I'll let him tell you about it. The guy you might not know who's on the panel this morning is a guy named Max Scoggin. He has, I think I know two things. He's probably the most famously, he and his partner Merrill are probably most famous for building the buildings in Atlanta that are most frequently attacked, torn down, and redecorated. There was a building about the size of the Zoolander nursery. I don't know if you remember that. A really small building in the middle of nowhere in Atlanta that during the Olympics they thought, oh my God, we have to completely redecorate this thing. It's an eyesore. And it was the Chamber of Commerce building. The other thing you might not know about him, there's a misprint in your folder. He's the Seijima Professional Practice Chair in Atlanta, which I think is really, is that right? Seijima?
No.
Sorry. I thought, well, what a world. He's the Kojima Chair of Professional Practice. So, Alejandro, thanks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, Jeff. This is one of these things that every time that I come to one of these symposiums, I find myself in the contradiction between having to address the subject of the symposium and having to show work. And what happens often is that the work is not necessarily exemplary of the of the subject. So take it as a series of reflections on the issue that Jeff has put forward to discuss today. I have been placed within the context of these sessions in the session that deals with the present, with the future as a commodity that is somehow embedded in the present. And I know why that is. That is probably because I come from a generation that from the very beginning was addressing the work or the practice of architecture as detached probably from looking at the past or trying to comment on the past and simultaneously trying to not trying to make big statements about the future, which was something that I think architects used to do before. So it was a generation that some of my colleagues call it of no hope and no fear. And it was a generation that or it is a generation that from the very beginning was engaged actually in trying to avoid formulations about the future and the past. And I think that as part of the theoretical background to the way we address work, there was a very important word, which was the virtual, which was actually a Peter Eisenman exploration at the time when we were starting to practice, which tried in some ways to avoid making or try to make possible to operate without having to constantly refer to this modernist idea of a narrative, of a social or political narrative that architecture had to had to support. So it was this is a project that we did long time ago. I think it's '97 actually for any corporation, the virtual house, where a series of geometries were trying to make or to produce a system that would then generate through these diagrams a number of different conditions. I'm not going to explain these projects, but I brought this project because I think that the idea of the virtual was at this point very important and very very used in relationship, for example, to the diagram as also an instrument that would enable the generation of multiple possibilities that were not necessarily seeking a kind of futurist narrative. So we started practicing at the time when this idea, the arrow of time that had characterized modern architecture and emancipation was fading out. Practice had to apply itself directly to the making of buildings, and in that sense, actually, I think that time was in some ways replaced by space. The narratives disappeared, and suddenly politics became the grounded on concrete objects, on concrete things. I mean, that is the whole discourse that people like Latour and Sloterdijk and Beck have been trying to articulate, in which political basis of reality is molecularized, is broken down into micropolitical environments where concrete aspects, rather than very important, very all-encompassing narratives, need to be implemented. And I think this, to me, still stands. I'm still hesitant about thinking about the future in a kind of comprehensive way. I think that as much as I've been trying for a while to retrieve that, I think is a project that died with the modernists, and this has been actually the subject of a number of considerations that I've been doing lately, trying actually to retrieve the political in architecture, or try to think how we can retrieve the political in architecture, because I don't think that we can, at the same time as I don't believe that the future, that architecture should address the future as a kind of all-encompassing narrative, I don't think that we can remain outside the political. So I was looking at a number of people that have shaped the discourse, the political discourse in the latest half of the 20th century, and realized that one of the crucial components of their discourse, this kind of all-encompassing narrative, was equality on different grounds. And then I realized that the people who actually had been effective at shaping the world where I grew up had replaced equality by cheapness. And so I think that it became quite an important realization, because these people had no political office. They were not making any all-encompassing narratives, and yet were probably much more effective at transforming reality than the people before, who yes, had set up the kind of parameters or the framework for the political discourse, but that was it. I mean, and as much as these people are as equally suspicious as the other ones, they were very effective. So, in terms of imagining the future, or how architects could possibly engage in politics in the future, I also started thinking about where to operate, because we used to operate always on the upper left corner. Architects were supposed to have imagination, were supposed to have a kind of fantastic, all-encompassing picture of how the world should be, and that was where the value and the vision lied. And yet, I think, looking at the slide, or looking at some of the people that came in the slide before, I think where actually the possibilities for transforming the future lie is on the other side of the market. Now we have these two markets. All architects are trying to get into that boat, but actually that boat is already full, and it doesn't really allow for I think it doesn't produce a substantial effect on architecture. And that has happened across a number of markets. I mean, with airlines, it is the same situation. The glamour of TWA and Air France is gone, and now we have EasyJet and Ryanair. And these people actually made crucial political contributions, for example, by declassing the airplane cabin, which was something that no other politician was able to do before. Now in the UK, David Cameron is trying to imitate the strategies of EasyJet to run councils, and in return, Ryanair is adopting political messages to sell tickets. So I think that there is clearly something in the air that that relates cheapness with contemporary politics that I think architects need to be very engaged with. So that's kind of first reflection.
Great.
Then a few more ideas. So as I said, I'm not a kind of great believer in all-encompassing visions, and I am much more interested in looking at the future as a piece of the present. In that sense, that the notion of the virtual was addressing the the problem. I think that there are a number of arguments that are floating also in the atmosphere, in the environment, that enable architects to operate in the present while operating in the future and in the past. And I'm particularly interested in those, rather than in making new statements about the future. So those are, I think, other than the economy or cheapness, the ecological imperative that already has been discarded this morning. But I still believe that things like life cycles, energy embedded into buildings, capital costs versus maintenance are issues that exist in the building industry that enable us to be operating now and looking both back on how things are going to move forward and what we inherit. The other important and maybe no, let me start from another one. The first perhaps the first parameter that I need to address, that I think requires from us to address the future and the past at the same time, is identity or branding, because buildings are obviously related to a certain context, to a certain collective, to a certain location, and in a way extract or can extract their potentials from that situation. And so now I can show a few buildings that explore to the extreme the issue of identity. Identity is something that relates to the past. For example, Shanghai Hills changing the coronation of the building to avoid looking like the Japanese flag in Shanghai. So there is a kind of relationship that resonates with the past, with the cultural traditions, and at the same time project architecture needs to project that past into the future. So this idea of how to produce identity is really interesting. This is a copy of a brochure that is made for a Foster project in Abu Dhabi. You see the relationship to history. I mean, Foster is probably not involved in this, so it's not a kind of critique, but it's interesting how buildings are sold and are explained. Life will never be the same again. I mean, talking about the future, business will never be the same again. Shopping will never be the same again. Luxury will never be the same again. Fashion will never be the same again. Fine dining will never be the same again, and so on and so forth. So that's basically how do you sell buildings today, and how in a way the future and the past reverberate. You will never be the same again through the building. Then the building is whatever. It doesn't matter. The other issue is the one I mentioned, which is ecology and the new situation in which we have to relate architecture or the artificial to nature, and how to organize the exchanges between architecture and nature with new technologies. All these two issues, ecology and identity, collide in the envelope, in the border of the building, in the limits of architectural or urban organizations. That's why I am particularly interested in that, and I've been researching this for a while. We used to live in a borderless world without temporal or spatial borders, and now the same mechanisms that we used to move things in space and in time are collapsing, and as a result of that, borders are back again. And so what I'm going to show you to illustrate the address to this idea of first cheapness, and then identity and sustainability is two projects, one of them in Madrid. And as I said, I don't pretend them to be examples of anything, but simply cases where maybe some of these things start taking place. The first one is a project done, it's a kind of literally cheap project. It's a social housing project in Madrid, in this place, in the outskirts of Madrid, in that location, where the project was dictated from the very beginning by strict economic constraints. First of all, because we were doing social housing, and then we had also a number of urban regulations to respect, which led us into the first idea about the experiment for this building was within the 6-story high limitations that we had, and within the side limitations that we have, can we make the building compact enough so that we save enough money on the skin to make a glazed, totally transparent social housing? That was the first experiment. They then immediately realized that the block was oriented east-west, and in Madrid that is not, it's not possible to orient a glass building like that. So we grew a skin around the units in order to fit the units in that volume. We had to make these very long tubular type of units, where in a way what we did was to compact all the windows that you would have in a social building in the two sides of the building, and therefore in the two sides of the unit. So let's say the facade, the window ratio is the same, but is compacted, and that is what produces that elongation of the type, and the fact that all the types are through types and therefore ventilate naturally. And here again, I'm starting to talk about perhaps mobilizing some of the kind of environmental possibilities that we are now starting to address. But the other thing that we did was to create this buffer space on both sides of the building that will, with the help of some louvers, protect the skin of the building from direct solar radiation. And it happened that at some point during the process we came across the possibility of doing it with bamboo, which is again a material that has low energy embedded, that is renewable, and so on and so forth. So that is what produced the building as it is now. It's a totally minimal, totally reductive form, because without that form we wouldn't be able to afford the skin that we that we designed for the building. And I think what is interesting about the facade, other than the economic solutions that we use to make the buildings, that if you see it in comparison with the other buildings, the other social or affordable housing that exist in the same area, you see the attempts of architects to try to embody also certain political messages, like difference, for example. You see that they paint the building in different tones, different shades of pink or red. They change the proportion of the windows. So there is a whole identity game going on there. Today you cannot do a Miesian social housing because everybody will call you a fascist. So I think that what is interesting about this facade, other than doing whatever it does environmentally, is precisely the possibility of proposing an image of the community that is at once consistent and yet differentiated, and using this environmental device in order to produce that image. These are the buffer zones. So this is the first project. The second project is a project that we are doing. Are we late already, or?
I'm fine.
You're fine. Okay, I try to go quickly with this. The second project is a project we are doing now in Birmingham, which is the redevelopment of Birmingham New Street Station. The central station in Birmingham is that 70s building. And this is not necessarily cheap in material terms, but is cheap because the commission is actually not to do the station, but to do, the station is going through a redevelopment program, but our commission is actually to do just the facade and the atrium. The rest of the station is done by another architect. So in a way, our involvement is skin deep. This is the current station. There is a plan of opening up the station and bring the city through it. And basically what we are doing is to generate the image for the station without necessarily being involved in the inside. That's why I think that the project is to a degree cheap, despite being not necessarily that cheap, not that expensive either. We are in charge of doing the atrium. I'm not going to explain this, but it's almost like an interior. But so the main question here, and this project has more to do with the exploration of identity as something that links the past of the city, or the tradition, or the cultural background with a possible future, was that we had to design a skin that we couldn't relate to the inside of the building at all, because there is a shopping center on top of it. And so when we started doing the project, we thought, well, how can we construct the skin of this building without any transparency with the inside? Again, talking about the envelope. And then we started thinking, well, Birmingham we have a station. Birmingham is a crossroad city that has this kind of tradition of people going through, so we started thinking, well, maybe we can blend a number of things that are happening in Birmingham. Birmingham used to have a very black sky, but now the steel industry is gone, and climate changing is producing a beautiful sky to celebrate. There will be electronic displays in the station that will show also this idea of movement of people, crowds of people going through the station. In some ways, what we were trying to do is to activate a number of things that existed there and try to blend them into the trains that are going underneath the station but cannot be seen at the moment. So we in a way, what we tried to do was to bring these four elements into something that will bring them together and make that into that new expression of the station. And we set out to do this by wrapping the station in a reflective skin that was calculated in order to reflect always these four elements: the trains, the commuters, the sky, and locate the screen. So in order to do that, what we did was to do a series of sections around the building that were measuring from what was the depth of the field of public space in front of the station, and then construct their reflections so that we would not reflect the buildings in front, but always the sky, the ground. So this is the way we constructed the different sections around the building, and then we morphed them into the skin that will become the new identity of Birmingham New Street, which is hopefully going to become a device to be able to see also the changes that happen during the day in the city center. So that those are some of the images, and you can see how the facade of the building in a way is like a Koyaanisqatsi type of thing, where you see clouds, you see people going in, you see trains, and all these things are mixed in the you see the electronic displays, and so all these different things are going to be the new image of the station, hopefully bringing together the past of Birmingham as a hub city, as a transport city, but hopefully also producing a new identity for this building as an example of Birmingham, or as a synthesis of Birmingham's new identity. I don't know if I mean, there is no actually conclusion to this, and maybe it's not necessary to say much more about this, except that actually all this goes back to that image that we started with in the virtual house, where the geometry of things is what focuses, what captures maybe the possibilities of bringing together those three times: the present, the future, and the past into the building. I don't think that there is. That these are tests of the facade that we are doing now, and I think that maybe with this I finish. Thank you very much.
It can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow-minded if you're young at heart. You can go to extremes with impossible schemes. You can laugh when your dreams fall hard to see, and it's more with each passing day, and love is eager in your heart its way. Don't you know that you have never learned to be young at with impossible schemes. You can laugh when your dreams fall apart at the seams. And love gets more exciting with each passing day. And love
seem to vanish like a gambler's lucky streak. When we're out together, dancing cheek to cheek. Oh, I love to climb a mountain and reach the highest peak, but it doesn't thrill me half as much as dancing cheek to cheek. Dance with me, I wrap my arm about you. The charm about you will carry me through to
for it's hard, you will find, to be narrow-minded if you're young at heart. You can go to extremes with impossible schemes. You can laugh when your dreams fall apart at the seams. And life gets more exciting with each passing day. And love is either in your heart or on its way. Don't you know that it's worth every treasure on earth to be young at heart? For as rich as you are, it's much better by far to be
Deal with that phone Indian and talk to a man. Oh, don't hide it, Crystal. Everybody knows you're not Stevens type. I never understood why you picked you up in the first place. Look, Sylvia, I'm gonna take a shower. Wait for me in my bed.
Do you think perhaps just once I might use the bathroom by myself?
No, some useless.
What?
Okay, let's see Cars movies. Show me Cars movies. Okay. On the phone.
That's my grandson. Two projects. We've been working on a project in India, which is an absolutely amazing place. The first time that Meryl and myself had ever been there. And what I really love about it is that it's just a complete immersion in contrast and contradiction, in innocence, paradox, all of those things that I think we should be worried about maintaining for the future of architecture. This, of course, is Corbu on the right. It's actually Corbu on the right as well, in the mill owner's house. That's Meryl giving human scale to Fata Sikri. Of course, if we've never been someplace, Meryl has to somehow, before we go, do a complete timeline of the history of the place and every important building that's ever been built for us to begin to connect to it. And India is just a fantastic treasure trove of architectural textures, styles, strategies, you name it, it's there. Our project is outside of Hyderabad, southern India. It's a new town that, with all of that richness of texture and architecture, this is our site. Nothing in actually out there except cow dung and some cows. It was a master plan that was developed or designed by Harry Cobb and Doshi for a developer, and a number of architects were invited to participate in designing the first few blocks of this town development. This was our site here. And it was an interesting process. We hadn't been there. We didn't go there until the whole group got together, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we were simply asked to come to a meeting and bring a scheme for one of the sites. We were given the site. So we did a lot of research and then just simply started the design with maybe kind of naive, but as informed as we could be, even doing things like site analysis for something that doesn't really exist, a site analysis of a master plan. Our idea was to construct a public space. One thing that did strike us about India, that public space was the most amazing negotiated condition, I think, in the history of mankind. You build something on a street, what happens between your building and the street is up for grabs. And it's incredible what does occur in those sort of creases of the urban context. So we decided to concentrate our project into a couple of towers and a podium scheme. And what we also were trying to think about was, in fact, this kind of paradoxical condition of India in the 21st century and going back many, many centuries, and the kind of texture and lifestyle of what was going to be a kind of middle income city, the entire city, mainly housing in this city. So we put together this little model to take to this meeting in Ahmedabad. So here are the players. You might recognize that individual that happened to show up here today as well. This Alejandro, this is the client here. I'm not asleep, I'm taking notes. It's Harry Cobb, Doshi, Nadir, Tarani, Jeannie Gang, Tom Pfeiffer, Mark Sexton, I left out Ken Smith, landscape architect. This was we had this meeting in the mill owner's house in Ahmedabad. It was the most amazing meeting I think I've ever been to. I don't know if you could really call it a meeting. There was never more than 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people talking at the same time. I mean less than that. It was total, complete chaos. Alejandro, am I right? Yes. But what was incredible about it, that all Jeannie Gang, and it was to talk about these particular sites, and the ones that were contiguous were our site here, Jeannie Gang's site, and Nadir's and Monica's site here. And we brought little models, and actually none of this was planned. We had not one word with each other. We just showed up. We all happened to have the same scale model. We bought this base, and somebody had another piece of paper, and we all put them on the model. And it was, well, I think it was actually pretty amazing how really well they worked together. 3 entirely different schemes with Jeannie Gang and this kind of matte field condition with this big, huge box, which was at the end of the city, actually, or you could say it was the one entry point to the city. And we made this sort of public plaza that Nadir wisely framed for us to the north. And then he had this sort of series of lower buildings and, in fact, one other tower. So we're very proud of ourselves. We were so naive in going there, all 3 teams. There were so many things that we didn't know about, so many constraints that we had never dreamed of. We just simply showed up because we were asked to, and we had a sort of a program. The things that governed this project were things that had to do more with the culture of the place, the climate of the place, the lifestyle of the place than we any of us had predicted. Basically, when you were doing housing here, and it varies in parts of India as I understand it, but as you're doing housing here, first of all, each unit has to have complete fresh air ventilation throughout, which means essentially each unit is a separate house. So we showed up proposing a high-rise building of separate houses, not knowing that. The model just had a whole bunch of little parts to it. The other part that we actually didn't take seriously, and I don't think the master plan, or I know the master planners, even with Doshi on the team, didn't take seriously. There's a sort of traditional Hindu system of design that's based on directional alignments called I have to look at my notes here. Vastu Shastra. And we thought it was kind of funny, and all of a sudden they started talking about this, and they said, well, you have to, the marketplace here demands it. And they didn't have a consultant. They had all this room full of people, didn't have a Vastu Shastra consultant, so they called Mumbai and got the Vastu Shastra consultant to come in the next day, and he declared the mill owner's house to be haunted or something, and then started divining things with sticks and stuff. And before long, what we understood was that, in fact, this had all developed in Hyderabad, and that it was an absolute necessity. So, in trying to put this design together, and I'm just going to sort of flick through these because I think you'll get the idea. In trying to stack all these units, it was one thing to just give them circulation, fresh air circulation, but to try to position in a building in any kind of configuration other than just a single corridor building, to try to configure the approaches to the units in the arrangement of each room and how it had to relate to the coordinates, it was a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. It took us literally months to actually solve the problem, and I'm not sure any of the other teams ever had the time. We had a little bit more time than the others ever actually solve the problem. And the only reason I'm saying all this is that on the one hand, it was a huge challenge, but on the other hand, was a fertile ground for what could be some fairly spectacular architecture. And I'll just show you a few iterations that we went through with the towers. We did want two towers that had somewhat separate identity to them. If you can imagine trying to do a tower structure with all these units flipping and flopping, and by the way, there's like 6 or 8 different unit types on top of all that, and then running all the plumbing and structure and whatnot through the tower and allowing for, in effect, public space up in the tower is quite a trick. So in many ways, the towers are a product of that kind of necessity of the architecture for this place. 2 different strategies in the towers. One we call the megapore, and then one the multipore, where one had very large areas of publicness up in the towers, and the one where every single floor was a sort of public space. Real just basic and straightforward, actually. You can kind of see the difference here where you have these big central spaces in the tower, and then the much more complex, but in many ways simpler arrangement of the units around public circulation. I'm just going to flip through these floor plans very quickly just to give you an idea of the complexity of this. I'm leaving out a few floors of parking and stuff like that. The towers did end up in actual, what they called penthouses, which were, in fact, just that, sort of 2-story units on the top. So a lot of interesting overlay of Western values within this place. Very debated and contentious ideas about the public space, especially at ground level, where we were trying to make this more of that sort of negotiated condition that you see throughout India. How would you control that, etc.? We spent a good bit of time looking at how we might, evolve the skins of the towers. The textures and colors there are just absolutely phenomenal. It opens up a kind of grab bag of possibilities that we're not immune to, at least putting down on paper for our own sort of explorations. I wanted to mention that was our large project. We were asked to do a large project and a small project. But I did want to mention, I thought what was most interesting about that actually was the process of that, of how we were hired, who we were working with, the consultants that were brought together, an enormous team, frankly, that were not brought together by us, but by the client. And then going to this sort of foreign place, assuming a kind of naivete and sort of going from there. Just mention quickly other sort of large things that we've been doing lately. This is a new campus at Harvard across the river in Austin, where we were part of a competition to look at that. We were attempting to create a new kind of Harvard Yard. A project that we just finished a few months ago for Harvard, looking at the entire other side of the river, the Cambridge campus, looking at how we could transform the campus to make it sort of more user-friendly, more interactive, more engaging, not just from an academic standpoint, but almost more so from a social standpoint. So the idea that you could actually take an institution that large, that complex, incredibly, ridiculously complex, made up of individual units, and try to literally change the nature, the character of it through architecture. This is a project we're working with Michael van Valkenburg in Toronto, where when I say we're working with him, we're working for him. We're part of his team that he's assembled of about 35 different consultants. This is the Lower Dons development project. It's essentially it's dockyards now and vacant, reclaimed or structured land on the edge of the city, spectacular site. And then a project that we worked on for a couple of years. A lot of people, you probably know a lot about this project, the Stuyvesant town in Peter Cooper Village here in Manhattan, where we were asked to try to figure out what to do with it in terms of architecture and landscape architecture. I thought the mix of those things is more interesting in terms of how architects may be working in the future as opposed to the actual what we did on them. It's I think the way in which we do work, the way in practice is structured is surely going to change in the future. At Yale, this is the small project I wanted to show you. This is Yale campus, and our site is here. It's very important to know that that's a cemetery. Our site is in effect going to be the northernmost east-west connection. In fact, the only sort of east-west connection to the north that brings together a new development of the Yale campus to the east with the existing campus to the west, and it's around the cemetery. Our project is Health Services Building, and it's more than just an infirmary. This is, in fact, a place where the whole community goes for health care at Yale. And this is a very important aspect of this project. If you could imagine going to your whole life, literally, and actually generations of people going to this building for a pretty personal and private, you might say, activity with a whole group of people that know you. And know you in different ways and actually have working relationships with you and personal relationships with you, that's a very odd thing. And something that the client, the user group, talked a lot about and wondered about, what, if anything, we could do about that, or if it was just a given. The other thing that the university was more concerned about was just simply the site and how you would arrange the site. And it was a competition actually for a site design, not a building design. And our strategy was to take, these typical, Yale is obviously this sort of block system of colleges and academic facilities all built around the city block, the scale of the block. In various and weird and strange configurations, our argument was that there's almost every kind of configuration you could think of, and that we just sort of, even though we only had we had a health facilities building, a police station, and a parking garage. There's no academic facility, that we could take that same strategy and leave the middle of the site open to encourage this kind of path across that end of the campus. And then, of course, taking into consideration all of the aspects of safety and publicness of this facility next to neighborhoods, etc., gave us a site condition where we ended up with a pretty strange shape for a health facilities building. We worked with Perkins and Will here in Atlanta on this project, by the way. They were fantastic colleagues throughout this whole project and continue to be. With them, we looked at there'd been a number of other schemes, by the way, that were done on this site that were rejected. That's why they had the competition. And generally, those schemes and others in the past always done this way, where you enter, everybody enters together, everybody waits together, everybody disappears into the black hole of functionality into health facilities, into a health care facility. And of course, the clinicians are the ones that actually get some kind of view or light. So you get this kind of generic diagram of function, sort of access to light, and etc. The main idea that we wanted to present to Yale was that this process should, in fact, be almost antithetical to this generic condition, where when you come into the building, you start a process that goes from public and gets more and more private as you get into the building. It completely changes the diagram from this very functionalist-driven condition of the way in which the doctors and all of the sort of function of the building are tightly organized, very, very efficient, to one that actually, at least in diagram form, would be horrifying to any of these kinds of clientele, and in fact was horrifying to the user group there. However, people like Bob Stern and others thought our site plan was so great They said, "Oh, just start working together, and it'll all work out." And in effect, that is what we did. And we completely reprogrammed the building. We actually proved that this shape was much more efficient shape than sort of a pure rectangular shape. If you can imagine, it's basically a kind of a circle. These were the plans that we presented in our competition submittal. Again, horrifying to the user group. But at the same time, they were really, to their credit, quite intrigued by this idea of moving to a more private condition and always moving towards light, always having access to external views and to light. So the idea was to do that in plan and then in section accomplish somehow the same condition. And in fact, to make a building that was had a kind of almost human quality to it, where it had no apparent sort of rational relationship between its internal condition and the external condition. In other words, it looked like it might get fat someday, or it might lose weight, or it might get bruised, but it had a kind of almost organic or dynamic condition. These are all our competition submittals. You know, where it was a site plan, nobody was going to design the building, right? They said, don't design a building. Well, everybody, of course, did. Again, we were working with Michael Van Valkenburg on the landscape for this. I just flashed through these quickly. The plans as you can tell, they evolved a bit, where we organized, when we could, exam rooms, but a lot of these others are exam rooms as well. We organized only the exam rooms that needed to be organized. We took the doctors and put them off to the side, so they were the ones that had to actually walk to the exam rooms. We took the waiting rooms for the various departments and always put them in places where you would have a view, and then as you moved to your exam room, you were always moving towards the light. I know it sounds strange. It's a very simple idea, but to talk to this client who had never actually talked to architects that were talking at first conceptually about movement through the building, about community, about literally redefining their processes, how they did their work, how their building functioned, was incredibly brave of them to be patient with it and to try to work through it, and for them to invest in that, in architecture's power and ability to actually address those kinds of issues first in the building, and not second, but at least simultaneously with the more practical necessity of the building, was a fantastic experience for them. 850 rooms in this little building. It's not that big a building. Somewhat of a planned nightmare. The materiality of this at Yale, what I was so fascinated with Yale, it's got these number of buildings, especially contemporary buildings, that are at once really, really heavy and light as a feather. The Beinecke Library, I think, is a fantastic building, because it once looked like this. It's just so heavy, but it's always floating. And I think this building does the same thing. And of course, the skating rink and Sheridan's dorms, they're just this wonderful combination of the light and the heavy, which, you don't make anything light if it's not heavy at first. Can't be light if there's nothing for it to contrast against. So anyway, these are the renderings that were sort of design development stage. It's really difficult to pick up form of the building. There are a lot of very subtle, I guess you could say, deformations of the building that again are somewhat irrational. That none of the floors line up. By the way, there's 850 rooms. There's not one extruded room, not one, because none of the floors in section line up. Some of them are the same size, but they don't stack in section. This is the entry space, which if you could sort of transform in scale, it's actually a very small space. It's just very high. And it collects this sort of public space, gives you a point of orientation, which is again at the heart, and it's really at the heart of the building because of the shape of the building. Anyway, then you gradually move from that space into the waiting areas, then back into more sort of functional spaces. And yes, we have to do all that stuff in this building. It's really interesting. I've always thought the cardinal rule in architecture was never ever get into a composition game. This is a composition game. Not so easy to do. Never has been. I'm not so sure how well we did with it. We'll see. The exterior skin of the building was took a lot of time to arrive at what we thought was the only real material to do this building. It was just a brick. We looked at every kind of new technology, prefabrication, etc. It boiled down to a brick because of the subtle deformation of the building, and to try to make something that was at once heavy and light. So we designed a brick with this. This is early, but it ended up being a little bit different than this. I guess I probably shouldn't admit it, but because there were some really interesting structural challenges with the brick. The masons don't use computers. Put it that way. Anyway, so we had to do a lot of just very practical things in today's world, where we're trying to explain what parts of the building actually are either radically have radical geometry or warped surfaces, what do not, in trying to figure out where you make the investment in the building. This is the brick as it ended up. Again, I love this because it just looks like archaic as hell. And the fact is, this took a dozen people to try to figure out what all we needed to do, because the brick it's obviously weighted. This is the shape of a normal brick, and all this is extra weight. So we ended up having to make these notches and things and use special mortar. The brick ties every 16 inches on center, vertical and horizontal. And it does lean a little bit. This actually in the building is like, 25, 30 feet out. And this particular brick is the brick that we worked with before on a project in a shape that somewhat similar to what we have used before, but we love it because it's at once light and heavy. Picks up the sunlight. And you can do those sorts of things with it. The fire marshal came out here when they took some scaffold down, and they said, "There's no way. There's something. You guys have screwed up. The thing's all falling down, and you expect us to try to inspect that?" So anyway, but this gives you an idea of what the brick does do in the sunlight. It's really quite beautiful. It's obviously still under construction. It's supposed to be finished in May. Yeah. Well, there's brave architect. Just one closing remark about the future. You know, I do think that the maintenance of paradox and innocence and naivete, the invention of the gizmo, are things that's what we should be worrying about the future. We should be thinking about. And I don't think that, I love Shirley Franklin's talk last night. Those of you that didn't come to that, you really missed an inspiring moment when she talked about the future. You know, she talked about thinking about 50 years ahead. You know, and she assumed that that's what we did. I mean, I was kind of, this is one thing that surprised me a lot. She assumed that architects had to do that, that planners had to do that you couldn't operate in our discipline without that. And I think she's right. If it's 50 years, I don't know. Probably little Ben, 3 years old, just turned 3 years old, you know, can use the same device that you use just as good as you can. You know, and you think you're at the state of the art. He's 3 years old. We better start thinking about the future because the future is really behind us almost immediately these days. Thank you very much.
Let me say just a few things. Instead of confining you to questions, we invite you to do all the things that you always are going to do anyway, which is to make statements and and polemics and speeches and all that sort of stuff. Just if you're going to ask a question to somebody, let them know that first so they can listen more closely. Or if you want to make a speech but turn it into a question, I have a trick for you. It goes like this. You make your speech and then you say, "Don't you agree?" And then... So these are just some of years and years of being in this. I just wanted to make a few observations about the morning. When Alejandro and Farshid started their practice, they named themselves FOA, and it was a kind of direct declaration of their sense of always going to be foreign wherever they work. It was not an internationalism statement, but an idea of, let's say, celebrating alienness. And yet he shows a project in Spain from his native country and a project in England, his adopted country. Mac, on the other hand, hick from Atlanta and partnered with a hick from Clarksville. It shows a project in India where he...
I take great offense at that.
But even more foreign than India is Yale. So I thought the idea was, so I'm just going to give you my flow of consciousness for a minute, then I'll formulate this question. Second one, I was struck by Mac because he kept talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, and I thought that's a nice idea. Light at the end of the tunnel has two meanings in my memory. One is that it means things are getting better, like you would want in a health center, but it's also the near-death experience. And I thought, perhaps it's not a metaphor.
It's a cemetery next door.
Yeah. Is that where the light is?
Paradox.
I thought, though, I want to start it with, basically, Alejandro said something I thought was quite interesting and quite important. He named his generation No Hope, No Fear, and basically understood them, and I consider myself part of that, to have decided that the reflection on the future, fantasies about the future, was just a dead issue in architecture. It had been killed by the failures, discredited failures of modernism, and that the best way to mobilize architecture politically, intellectually, and culturally, was to stay focused on the real and not, but to try to de-abstract the real. And I thought that was an extremely interesting moment. And it had two kind of precedents. One was Tafuri's argument that we should avoid projective practices or projective criticism, and that became the sort of theorization of it. There was also a post-humanist dimension to that, where your job was no longer to imagine, put yourselves in the shoes of the user in any sense, because all you could possibly do by doing that, no matter how sensitively you did it, was to abstract them, and that abstraction would always be violent. And so the way you operated to be most politically mobile and was to withdraw from these two prior ways that architecture understood themselves to be instrumental. And then Mack, I thought, showed these series of films, the Where's Alice film, which I guess he just told me they made. It's a beautiful film. And it had two themes as far as I understood. One was that to be young at heart meant essentially to always understand that you have a relationship to the future as your own experience, because youth is a kind of definition of this future, but also a responsibility to youth. But then you showed something really interesting. You showed these series of films, and in every one of the films, the structure of the film has to do with the misuse of a room in the building. So Alice goes into the drawer, the bathroom where the boys are looking at the boys' underwear. In other words, every time...
It was girls' underwear.
Girls' underwear.
Thank
you so much for...
I just want to point out, it was girls' underwear.
That was not a slip.
Yeah.
It was not a
Oh, no, I'm sure.
I'm just telling you, I said that on purpose.
I'm sure that was, everybody has their dreams come true. Just a hick comment, I don't know.
I think it was Alice in Blunderland, actually.
But and for me, the apotheosis of all of that was in The Shining, because basically the beautiful structure of The Shining is that each of the characters has a proper space in the hotel. Jack is always in the major spaces. Shelley Duvall is always in the domestic spaces, and the little boy is always in the interstitial spaces. And everything is fine as long as each one stays in their space. But all the surprises and drama occurs when one goes into the wrong space. And the beautiful scene where Shelley Duvall can't get out of the window. Yet you do so it looks to me like you are now going to celebrate a kind of post-humanist relationship to the program. And yet all of your work is about thinking more and more and more and more as you possibly can about what the actual experience of the building will be for its users. And I've accused you of this in every public setting we've been in. That strikes me as no matter how well-meaning that is, it's a kind of violence. Like you have imagined the experiences of the people in India, you are imagining the experiences of the people at Yale, and yet your films seem to suggest that the goal of architecture is to produce event structures that can't be imagined, events that can't be imagined. And I think it was Cedric Price who introduced that idea into architecture as a way that we could be political without being humanist. And I wanted to hear what your response to that was. I actually yelled at you at SciArt about the same thing. I don't know if you remember.
First of all, well, you just came up with another sort of shocking word, violence, threw that in. Well, the bathroom was where more social happening was occurring than any other place in the film, arguably. And it's the only necessity left for architecture, basically.
Social interactions or bathrooms?
Both. I mean, if the building is not about social interaction or the relationship between the individual and the social or society, then I would say it's probably not architecture. And if it doesn't have a bathroom, it's probably not architecture. Although there are lots of versions of bathrooms, as we saw. But people don't just go to the bathroom to go to the bathroom, obviously, in the film. And if you look in the history of film, which we looked at a little bit, the choices that one has in showing events in bathrooms or types of bathrooms is absolutely phenomenal. probably film more than any other space in buildings.
But in your buildings, in the plans of your buildings, your bathrooms are thought of as how they're going to work in terms of as bathrooms, because everything is thought through as a choreographed experience as you imagine it in the name of the viewer, in the name of the user. Sorry. And Yale in particular is about essentially almost like a Van Eyck-esque ultra scripting of a sensitivity to all of the passages in time in this precarious situation. So it seems you seem to complete. Now, the reason I ask is that I think architecture's role basically has been to cause us to, like, you know, for example, Baroque, in its decision, in its ambition to complete the Renaissance, sets into motion a kind of privilege of immersion and personal experience, which actually counters the Renaissance idea of the ideal and probably leads to the sort of selfishness that we associate with modernism through Romanticism. And so architecture is constantly producing a next state existential character in the way it performs precisely the way your buildings don't perform. I mean, as much as your buildings perform well, architecture does its work when it's not performing well. Architecture does its work in relationship to the future.
Well, let me.
When it's not performing well.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, I think you're putting it in more negative terms than I would like for it.
I wouldn't
to be.
disagree. That's a double negative.
It's not as negative as your terms. Even as a double negative, it makes it less negative, oddly.
Okay.
I think the reason the iPhone, the app, and little Ben on the iPhone, I think is really important to that little video is that in fact the iPhone is just a beginning of something. You know, it actually just sets up a social order for engagement. It's an amazing tool, amazing machine, but it, in and of itself, is only the start of something. And it transcends its machine. And it invites investment, social investment, economic investment, you name it. More machines. It turns into a musical instrument. It tells you where you are. It does all sorts of things. You know, what it suggests is the architecture of the future at once satisfies a program, but completely transcends the program. And that the program for the future is basically a connection to a social and economic condition that will sustain the actual initial program. And I think that's, you look at most great architecture, it pretty much does that.
I don't I don't know whether that is necessarily the case. So you seem to be saying that architecture only performs for the future when it misperforms
for the present.
For the present.
Even in ambition to perform for the present, it's only in its misperformances. Essentially,
if it doesn't challenge, well, of course, I would just say, of course, yes. Essentially,
what I'm trying to figure out is how do you pay attention to the present with that? When I say violence and abstraction, you know, I mean, of course, this comes out of the discourse of academia from feminism and all the enfranchisement discourses or deconstruction. You know, if you're watching a cowboy movie and you're an American, you know who the good guys and the bad guys are. But if you're an Indian, you know who the good guys and the bad guys are. They're different. So the idea that there can be an adequate abstraction, even on the basis of something as simple as a medical program, and that you could actually add more intelligence to it than has evolved through the institution in its own. I mean, basically, one of the principles underlying Alejandro's work on envelopes is that a great deal of intelligence has gone into plans. These people know exactly what they want their plans to do, and the arrogance that you might go in and think better about the plans because you happen to know a whole lot of plans turns out not to be either economically or socially sustain it. So let me add to that question another question for you about fascism. It's important, I think, for us all to remember that the very first nation on earth that I know of in history, after Rome, to declare itself fascist was the United States. It does so 3 times. One is E pluribus unum. Secondly, united we stand, divided we fall, united we stand. But if you look on the back of the Mercury dime, what you will see is a fascia. So the symbol of the United States and on money, and it was removed in the 30s because of the rise of Nazism. So, and the reason I say that is the Beck, Sloterdijk, Latour, and maybe Johnny Vattimo, I would add to those, in their molecularization, they're actually, it's a kind of disguised call for sameness, and in other words, it's a reconsideration of fascism without its legacy of Nazism. When you talk about boundaries coming back up again, and the idea that disciplines are going to behave autonomously in a certain way, have their own truths, weak truths. So it was really extremely interesting to me that even though you're interested in that, your work tends to find even more subtle ways to maintain its allegiance to the discourse of difference. So you make fun of the Dutch model of painting difference, but you figure out ways to make sure that the performance of the screen engages difference. You may think Frank Gehry's idea of contextualism, where his forms like Birmingham are about referring to and evoking the local formal language, and you decide to make it evoke the local performative language, the trains and the people moving. But nevertheless, it's about locality, specificity, and difference. And so it was hard for me to reconcile those 2 aspects of your discourse.
What is the first one? No. I was called recently a neo-regionalist, and I think that is true to a degree. But so I don't know with what you want to reconcile that with some sort of.
I'm curious about, for example, and I'll ask one more academic question. Remember, I told everybody I had a readership of up to 12 people, so I'm going to turn it over to somebody with a readership of 10 million. But Houellebecq, I don't know if the French writer,
yes,
wrote a really important novel called, it's been translated twice. Once is called Atomized, and the other one is Elementary Particles, both the same novel. And what the novel is 267 pages of desperation, horrible life based on radical selfishness, indulgence in sexuality, a sense of libertinism at the excess of modern individualism, and the lack of a relationship to a collective. And everybody reads that part. But the climax of the novel, which most people don't read, is the appendix, which is actually written from the point of view of the future about one of the characters who had lived through that despair, who basically produces a great and better future by getting rid of the discourse of enfranchisement and individuality and equality, essentially, by turning everybody and everything into the same, but as a positive attribute. And so it seems to me that your philosophization leads to an argument about abandoning the discourse of difference, even though your work maintains its devotion to the discourse of difference.
But I think that you need to do both at the same time, and that's probably the argument that is both behind the two projects that I showed. I think both Carabanchel and Birmingham are envelopes or physical enclosures that play a single material, a single technology, but make a great deal out of differentiating it.
But so they also go out of way to be different from everything around them architecturally.
They
each go out of their way
to
be iconic or different from all the architecture.
The surroundings. Yeah. Yes.
So they exaggerate their difference in the name of a new model of expressing the difference and sameness of the clay.
But I mean, I think that this is something that you can see it as an index of a contemporary situation that is particularly acute in Europe, with all the problems about ethnic integration that are happening in the Netherlands or in Paris, where at the same time, or the famous Chirac ban of religious signs, and that whole discussion in the UK. Trevor Phillips saying that the model of multi, how is it? You probably remember this multiculturalism, which has been one of the pillars of the British politics since the 70s, is dead now, because it only generates ghettoization and irreconcilable differences. So now it's not about contemporary politics. At least contemporary politics in Europe now are no longer about protecting differences, but about trying to find grounds across these different groups. So the tension between some sort of strategies for consistency and at the same time the almost latent need to generate differences, I think is a very common problem of political representation that obviously I am sensitive to, and probably that's how these things come about.
I mean, an observation and then a question to you both, really, which is about film. I think one would have to say that describing the Romans as fascist doesn't mean very much. I mean, actually, in contemporary language, we can only use the word fascist and understand it in relation to actually what Charlie Chaplin satirized in The Great Dictator. That's to say, it is, in fact, whether we like it or not, it's Mussolini and Hitler. And it's a bit like, I mean, saying America was a fascist state is a bit like saying that Sweden was a slave state because they didn't abolish indentured employment till 1952 or whenever it was. Well, yeah, okay, in theory, but you know...
They didn't?
But the thing is, Jeff, that in theory is what interests you because that's your world. Now, there's a very simple because, you know, it works in practice, but does it work in theory, as they say? Now, the reason that somebody commissioned Foreign Office to do that tricky east-west side, and they come to a conclusion, was because they wanted a good architect to do it. They didn't know they were going to use bamboo. They didn't know what they were going to get. But they were assuming that it would be rather different to what was across the road, because if they wanted what was across the road, they could have hired those guys. And I think that the accidental and the occasional and the simple business of procurement and why people get jobs and why you have competitions is a simple level as much as an explanation as what those commissions and then what that architecture becomes as a representation. In other words, the readings of it are always as completed and what does it represent against the whole other background, whereas there are some simpler readings. And if we go back to what Shirley Franklin said last night, I mean, her point was, firstly, that people will make sacrifices even at a time of trouble if they believe in the future benefit of what's being proposed. Now, the specific example she gave was, of course, water and sewerage, which was a big problem in Atlanta. But guess what? It's a big problem in all the major cities. They've got a water problem in Barcelona, even though it's next to the sea. There are water and sewerage problems absolutely everywhere. And if you're looking for propositions about the future, which may affect architecture, it has knock-on consequences, even if not direct commissions, of coping with these environmental concerns, I think is a very big issue. So she was able to talk about a 50-year view, or planning for 20 or 30 years' time. But the critical thing was her additional comment was, if you're planning for 20 or 30 years' time, What is it that you do now? Now, I think in a sense this is a response to your point about the kind of inevitable, possible future failure of a building against its current success, or it might be the other way around. I mean, there are examples of buildings which had a very short life for their initial purpose because of a change in gizmos or technology. There's a building in London which was used for about 5 years as a sort of round table for railway engines to turn around, and then they changed the station and it became a gin warehouse for 150 years, and now it's been turned back into a performance space. Right. It's over-engineering and expense, which looked catastrophic 10 years after it was built, have turned out to be a kind of marvellous social and now economic contribution to the city. The question that I wanted to ask arose from the film, which was to ask each of you to what extent your imaginings about the future have been influenced, or certainly perhaps in your formative years, but perhaps later, by the sort of films which have posited kind of clearly they are imaginable futures because they've been portrayed on screen. But just to take one example, Fritz Lang, when he comes to America for the first time, arrives on a transatlantic liner, and he has a problem with his passport. There's a problem about immigration, which means that he can't get ashore for one night, and he stays in the cruiser, looking out at the towers of downtown Manhattan with its lights and its scale and its drama from his bunk in the transatlantic cruiser. And what he sees that night, the scale and the lights, etc., of course becomes Metropolis in 1927. If we flip forward 70 years, we have something which is like Metropolis with gizmos, because the navigation systems have all been sorted out, and we've got Luc Besson's Fifth Element. Now these models, and let's say 1968, do androids dream of electric sheep, which then becomes Blade Runner. Now those models of whether it's utopia or dystopia or somewhere in between are places where architecture and ideas about urbanism and planning have been transformed by Hollywood, let's say, to use a phrase. And I wonder if in your work as architects, in thinking about possible futures, either for your buildings or the sort of cities that we might inhabit, or the no fear, no hope, or the other way round proposition, whether this filmic background has been of influence in your work or your lives. Mac, you made the film.
Not consciously at all. I'm not a big film buff. Don't have much time to go to watch films, so I don't really know. I haven't thought seriously. I'm not conscious of that. I think maybe the fantasy of film, some of the examples that you just cited, along with things like Popular Mechanics magazine, may and have influenced my generation and certainly me, things that were proposed, and everybody flying to work in their helicopters and all that sort of stuff. But not in terms of a kind of vision of architecture. I'd like to think, and Michael Meredith may talk a little bit more about this in his presentation, but I'd like to think that medium is in fact a bit untapped in terms of developing ideas in architecture. I mean, not just representing architecture, or not just seeing a different vision, but literally in terms of the production of ideas around architecture. I think it's a medium that has a lot of potential. Knowing there's been a lot of people for a lot of time working with film and architecture, I think it's untapped.
When you were being brought up in Atlanta, did you ever think about what is Atlanta going to be like at the age you are now compared with the age when you might have been looking at Popular Mechanic, or just thinking about, or seeing photos of other cities, or seeing news footage or anything like that? Did it ever come into play?
You know what? I don't really think so, because I think when I grew up here in Atlanta, it was almost an idyllic condition. White guy living in sort of suburbia of Atlanta.
Couldn't go downtown without a coat and tie on.
Well, my mother went shopping at Rich's department store every single Saturday of her life with her white gloves and hat on.
Exactly.
And that's absolutely true. And she caught the bus. Every Saturday, I caught the trolley by myself with my buddies, and we came down to Peachtree Street, and we went to Lowe's and Paramount and Fox Theater watching the movies. It was, what could be wrong?
Well, the way I went to movies, by the way, just so you know, is I would take a bus to Lenox Square, steal some English leather from Rich's, take the bus all the way downtown, return it to Rich's, get enough money to go to the movies, and go to the movies. Can't do that anymore.
Well, because they.
I
But
always,
that was their policy. They would
Take anything
take
you want.
anything back. That was their policy, written policy. No matter what, they would take it back.
whenever Jeff's around, I always hear a faint police siren in the background. Alejandro, what about film?
No,
Film for you?
For me, it's also not at least consciously an important reference of architecture. And I was quite interested in the way the session was described in the brief, because you call it commodity or value. So I think in a way that the manner in which I like to think about the future when I am doing a project is much more like what you would do, or what I imagine you would do if you are trading commodities. You think what's going to happen, and you try to see in what way you are going to manipulate what you are doing so that it will acquire more value. But there is no vision, no narrative, no all-encompassing vision that I can refer to as the future and the driver of.
But let me ask you about your cheapness argument. All of those, that was an incredible pairing of slides. I thought the equality and the cheapness issue. I was thinking to myself, man, you can really find a lot of neat stuff on the web when you have all that free time. No career left. All of those people made affected life, because people not only were doing well, but imagined they would do well in the future. And probably the single most dangerous thing to an economy, an economist will tell you, is when you start to fear the future and you hole up. And Shirley Franklin, I didn't hear the talk, but that's not just a sociological and psychological, it's a deeply important principle in economics, is that you have to have a sense of the going concern. Accounting is based on the going concern. You have to have a sense that there's a reason to save and sacrifice and buy, or else your fear sets in, and it basically becomes the self-destructive element in the economy. And so you actually must have a thought about the future to even maintain your realism. I mean, there has to be.
But I don't think that these guys. I mean, this is what I find fascinating about these people. I don't think that they sit there and they say, okay, so let's think how the future is going to be. I'm going to make the cheapest airline in Europe or wherever in the States. I think they think in a much more specific way. They know the process that running an airline follows, and they say, here we can save money, here we can save money, here we can save money. Therefore, we can offer the same product, or maybe not the same product, but by cutting down the product in a number of ways, we can suddenly turn around things. I don't think they have a vision like Che Guevara had a vision. They don't imagine the world as a whole picture. They operate on very concrete things. Greenspan playing with cheap money. Do you think that he knew what was going to happen if you suddenly bring the interest rates down as he did? I don't think so. I don't think that he could possibly imagine the cities being transformed by the fact that suddenly the interest rates are low, and so on and so forth. They
He knew
operate
housing was going to drive the economy. I mean, I think, well, I mean, let me ask you both a quick question.
It's a matter of representation, because finally architects, what we do is to represent something. I don't think that the reason why neither movies nor images are useful for me, at least, is because you cannot find an image that can represent the complexity of the contemporary politics or economics, and therefore the only way in which you can generate new representations is by operating on very specific, concrete, technical matters, geometry, etc. That was also part of the.
Yes, I think so. I'm going to. I mean, Paul said something that provoked a personal sense of my personal sense of architecture, and I'm just going to ask you a kind of ringer question. And y'all are going to. I can't really see y'all, and Paul can't either. Although Paul knows better to address the audience when he's attacking me than to look straight at me. But just out of nowhere, do you have any thoughts on Alto Sanitarium?
Alto Sanatorium, which one? I think he did a couple of them.
The tuberculosis sanitarium.
I knew the slab.
Yeah.
Thoughts on it?
Not that I.
You think it's important?
It's got an amazing smokestack on it that looks
great
like
piece of architecture, irrelevant piece of architecture.
It is a fairly interesting piece of architecture.
It's a trick, obviously a trick question.
Well, I mean, it's a building. It was the building when Paul said many buildings are born and soon become irrelevant. That was a building that was born irrelevant, because by the time it was finished, tuberculosis was identified. It was never used for tuberculosis. It's still highly admired in the world of architecture. Could have never been more irrelevant its entire life for any other reason than the degree to which it works on the imagination of architects.
It's still being used, isn't it?
Pardon me?
It's still being used. It was when I was there several years ago,
It's not used as a tuberculosis sanitarium.
but it's used.
It's like a.
It's used.
Yeah. So what? I mean, the issue
Well,
for me
so
is-
a
here's
lot
the
of
deal.
so what? Wait a minute.
Hang on, let me finish my speech.
How long is it going to take?
Long.
Okay.
Until you start doing like this.
I'm not moving.
I mean, the reason I
Watch
say
my
this
head.
is one issue that I take issue with every architect I know, and therefore I assume I'm wrong, is that architects have to feel like they serve a constituency.
Yes.
A client, and a client's relationship to a community, and a community's relationship to an institution. So you and politics are the only two practices that I know of that imagine themselves as addressing a constituency as opposed to an audience. But the fact of the matter is architecture's effects throughout history have always been audience effects. Not, it's architects and a few people interested in architects over hysterically admiring small effects by a very few buildings that construct the canon. If we were truly interested in the performance issues, we would be teaching, we'd have classes like schools, hospitals, we'd have classes on performance, but we don't have classes on performance. We have classes on construction, materiality, formal types, history, philosophy, theory. So I start to think that architecture, that a more liberating view of architecture's relationship to political work is not to understand that it's a beginning practice, not an end practice, an art practice. And that essentially it works on a very small group of people, hysterically, an audience, with collateral interests. Like when he asked me about movies, I think, if I asked most of the people in this audience, did you like Forrest Gump? Raise your hand if you like Forrest Gump. Okay, now I'm about to ruin Forrest Gump for you. So please leave if you don't want it ruined. But if you're a close reader of film from a critic's point of view like I am, here's the story Forrest Gump tells. If you're kind of dumb, unbelievably nice, athletic, white, I mean genuinely nice, athletic and white, you care about your friends, you will meet famous people, grow up, play sports, ping pong and football. You will grow up, be successful, be well admired, and have a good life. If you're a woman in a small town, unhappy with your lot in life, unhappy with the fact that you have no chance of being creative, goes out, protests against the war, tries to go to university, get an education, work in the arts, you're going to die of AIDS. So I can ruin anything you...
I've been called the female Forrest Gump, and no matter what my circumstances, I can always be creative.
Well, it's no accident while you're called the female Forrest Gump. You sound beautiful. I mean, when I left this town, I went to I went to this language school where they hook you up to electrodes, and as soon as you have a sound anything like a Southern accent, for example, if you don't say G, like going, or you say hunting and fishing, they shock you, and they get rid of your Southern accent so you can be. But when I come down here, it's like music. So I appreciate that. All I'm saying is to a film audience, to people that pay close attention to any practice.
But I also said something.
Really? What was that? No, I'm teasing. Now, of course you said something, what I'm pointing out is, for every practice, there's going to be a group of people, a bohemian demimon, that is going to be unbelievably sensitive to small bodies of effects in that practice. And in art practices, of which I call architecture, that's all we can do. So we actually never serve a constituency. We actually never, for example, lots of people talk about architectural research, but nobody goes back and checks whether the building actually does what everybody argued it was going to do. Who does? Exactly. Named after Edgar Allan Poe. I've had that joke for a long time. No, there is post-occupancy evaluation. No architects are interested in it. We don't use it. What we do is quite interesting. By the way, almost the post-occupancy evaluations are almost always limited to 1 year after occupancy. Is that correct? Okay. Architects will tell you that we will not come to know the architectural content of a building until 5 to 10, 15 years after occupancy. And there's no post-occupancy evaluation about that. Brasilia is now celebrated as an extremely successful example of urbanism because 5 generations have grown up there, colonized the space, learned the space. So post-occupancy evaluation misses the point of architecture entirely. Pre-occupancy surveys, which ask people what characteristics of the buildings they would like in their buildings, produce unbelievably bad buildings. So there's 2 buildings at Ohio State that were my university that were prize-winning buildings that were going to be dormitories. They did pre-occupancy surveys of students. They were both on the river, all of whom said what they really wanted in their dorms, but none of them thought they would even have to say windows to the view. And they all got what they wanted in these 2 gigantic towers with no windows. So the problem of abstraction, what I'm saying is architecture might be better off, in my opinion, if it understood it was like poetry. Basically, no one's interested in it, except a small number of effects. But it has collateral effects that you can't imagine, just like movies do, just like music.
I don't think so. I think that a lot of people are interested in architecture, and I think the problem of trying to teach or to discuss architecture based on effects is precisely that you are presupposing that you are capable of representing something in front of your audience.
Why are you and Harry and Mac and Merrill in India? Because you're more sensitive to the Indian, because they're incompetent at doing good architecture? Because what Paul says, you must be better architects?
Well, I think you have to...
That's exactly what you said. They've waited this long.
No, the point is they were there by invitation. And the
Yes.
reasons for the invitation are probably too complex, even maybe
No,
to
I don't
understand,
think so at all.
without a whole other story. But let me come back to this question. It should be called actually poets' occupancy evaluation on these grounds if poetry has the same status as architecture. But interestingly enough, of course, you know, T.S. Eliot famously remarked that poets are the antennae of the race. It's poets who get it first, then composers, and architecture struggles along fairly late because it takes a long time to build things.
That's
I mean,
true, but not half as late as...
you always get the theory before you get the buildings, and that's just the way it works out. And therefore, it's not surprising that occasionally you're going to have a building like that sanatorium, which, as you say, is redundant almost the moment it's being designed. But the architect didn't know that. Most people didn't know it. And the question isn't whether it is therefore worthless, either in the history of architecture or the history of anything. Because one of the characteristics of good architecture, I would say, you know, famously illustrated in that wonderful provocation, Buildings That Learn by Stuart Brand, are buildings that will last, which give more than they take and are not greedy in terms of resources. And you know what? If it's not one thing, it can be in another thing.
Yes.
Why can it be in another thing? Because of the skill of the architect in making some, what we might call not exactly universal space, but having a generosity of proposition about plan and section and diagram. And immediately that Yale thing is going to go into an architectural history of some sort because of the diagram. It doesn't matter whether they decide they're not going to do medical treatment in that building. I bet anything you like that you could convert that building into a whole series of different uses where that essential program of not wanting people to mingle and meet, but actually allowing them to be separate and private, would operate. So, I mean, I'm much less gloomy about this, and I think the relationship of architects to... The reason I ask about the film is that I think that architects, unconsciously or not, do posit the futures of towns and cities, and sometimes it's explicit,
Yes.
cool, Siam, and the whole let's make the world safe for highways engineers, and sometimes it's being done unconsciously. But even at the level of a simple housing block, I mean, that's probably a 125-year proposition at the very least, certainly if any of the units are going to be sold, because things that get sold, by and large, don't get knocked down. It's public housing that gets knocked down because somebody decides they'll write the debt off at some future stage with a politician with a reputation to make by knocking things down rather than building them up or replacing, in which case the original intention of the architect is scarcely relevant. I mean, my point would be, I think in both these presentations, what we had was an example of, I mean, functionalism, it sounds so unfashionable to say, oh my God, you haven't done a building that actually fulfills its function, have you? And anyway, how would you know? Because they haven't done the poets or post-occupancy evaluation. And anyway, what use is that? You're going to have to wait till we're all dead to find out whether it was any good. Or we wait 5 minutes and it will be on an internet publication that you can download. So what we've had here, I think, is what I would call advanced functionalism. Where the simple function, we want to make a building where people get treated. Sure, it's a function, it happens. And how successful it is, we will not know. Probably Yale do more post-occupancy evaluation than most others. But the other functions, to be close to a cemetery, to fit into a campus, to have an attitude to materials and scale and proportion and all that other architectural stuff, which doesn't get described as function, but it is function. Of course it's function. It's as much function as that initial first use of the building. So I think that what we saw up here, Alejandro's thing about sky and movement of both people and trains as it happens, well, let's say equipment. Of course it's site-specific. How can architecture be anything other? It is indeed in Birmingham, England. But the proposition's being made that in circumstances of a gigantic exchange of transport modes, of people, of shopping, of centre city vibrancy, the proposition that you should open up the view of the trains rather than close it down, that you see the sky and not buildings. I mean, this is advanced functionalism, I would say, of a high order. And I think that's, to me, what connected these things was that the things that Matt was showing in that medical building, I would say, have the same impulse. But as ever, with architecture, the extraordinary thing is, with the same program, on the same day, at the same time, and with examples which are both the same, because they're big and small, and utterly different, you do get propositions about the future of those buildings. And in aggregate, I think that does suggest a proposition about the future of wider environments.
Well, let me ask you a question about, by the way, beautifully said. And just so you understand, I understand. I remember you said you had a rich and creative life, so I didn't actually know you said something, Forrest. So here's what I think is going to happen in Birmingham, because I see this happening all the time with Frank's work. People go to Frank's work all over the world, and they think they're seeing sculpture. And I know what they're seeing is a deep formal contextualism. So I see the differences in every building. Like if you go to the Disney Hall and you don't see the Dorothy Chandler pavilions and you don't see the two towers in the background, you don't get the building. If you go to Bilbao and you don't see the mountains and you don't see the river, you don't see the context, then you don't get the building. But most people show up and see a piece of sculpture. What's going to happen in Birmingham is this. My wife and I are going to go there. Most people are going to say, God, this thing is ugly, or this thing is interesting. You're going to see sculpture. A few people, like my wife, I'm going to say, look at this. And she says, I get it. So what? That's mostly what she says about everything. I say, let me tell you about Mises National Gallery. It's an incredible story about the tragedy of war, the possibility of art in post-war Germany. And she says, okay, tell me. And then I tell her, and she says, okay, I get it. So what? You know, I just don't care. And then a few people like me are going to go to Birmingham, and you, and we're going to see those effects, and we're going to get extraordinarily excited about them, and look around for all the people that are sharing that incredible pleasure with her, and they won't be there.
No, but that's not a problem, because the real thing about that is that the people who do get it, you know, are going to give him another job. I mean, at one level, so we'll have better interchanges rather than worse.
I'm so glad I'm not in your world. Do you believe that? Because you're going to get that because it's a great business.
Well, they keep giving Frank work. I mean,
those people are there because they're interested in the marketability of a certain kind. I mean, I'm not against that, but you know, basically it's an exoticism. It's the same reason that there's a gigantic pagoda in the middle of Kew Gardens, for God's sake. You know,
incidentally, it was interesting that your two towers, which are both sort of similar and different simultaneously, I couldn't help thinking about Fred and Ginger in relation to your film. And of course, it was
Fred and Ginger, or
no, because Frank's is in Prague, but this one I think is just as good. In fact, I think it's better, because Frank ones, the curves are all wrong. Your ones, I think, are just right. Put a bow tie on the one on the left and a dress on the one on the right. Hey presto, you're in heaven, to coin a phrase. And if you remember, what's so powerful about that is that the analysis of why Fred and Ginger worked so beautifully together was that he made her classy and she made him sexy. And I think that kind of class and sex,
I found him very sexy.
As a kind of as a proposition about architecture is not bad. One aside before we close, incidentally, since Mies was mentioned, and the impossibility of doing Miesian housing anymore, all I can say is David Chipperfield's having a bit of a go at it, with some success marching across Europe. I think anything is possible. You know, you can do, and we are seeing social housing blocks now, which I don't know if you remember Wim Quist, the famous Dutchman, his buildings got increasingly boring and interesting as his career went on, and I think he's now got a challenger.
Any thoughts from the, we're going to close, but any thoughts, comments, speeches, outrages from the audience? Okay, we'll break. See you after lunch.